opening the path for the queen and king's bishop. This establishes immediate central influence and threatens opponent's pawn. Opening the door for the king's bishop, this quiet pawn advance prepares a flexible defense, aiming for central pawn breaks and often leading to strategic maneuvering. Establishing a central pawn duo, this immediately claims space and challenges black's pawn structure. Asserting central presence, this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's dominion and initiates a dynamic struggle for positional advantage. Developing the knight now pressures black's central pawn and prepares further piece activity in the core. Challenging white's pawn center directly, this knight's sortie immediately eyes the e4 pawn and signals active counterplay. Pinning the knight immediately adds pressure, aiming to exploit black's pawn structure and potentially disrupt their development. Immediately pinning the knight, black challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces. Aggressively seizing central space, white challenges black's knight and ignites a dynamic pawn struggle. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance creates immediate tension on the king side and potentially opens lines for counterplay. Securing piece harmony, the bishop repositions to both defend the knight and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, a subtle shift from the earlier aggressive posture to a more calculated positional battle. Black surrenders the bishop pair, but strategically dismantles white's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit the doubled c-pawns and create a more open game where their active pieces can gain influence. Reclaiming the bishop, white reestablishes a pawn barrier in the center, creating immediate tension and a slight queenside space advantage. The exchange, while removing a defender of black's central pawns, also grants white a doubled pawn structure that might offer later targets. A clever maneuver, this knight's advance immediately challenges the bishop pair and disrupts white's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit the pawn on e5. Proactively challenging the knight's central outpost forces black into a decision, potentially disrupting their pawn structure or surrendering valuable space. Bringing the king to safety is paramount, especially after the bishop exchange that opens lines. This establishes a solid defensive structure for the monarch, preparing for the inevitable central skirmishes and allowing other pieces to mobilize with greater freedom. Strategically repositioning the bishop to d3 aims to solidify white's control over the central dark squares and prepare for potential kingside action, while also offering a retreat if the knight on e4 proves troublesome. The knight reestablishes a solid central outpost, preparing to challenge the bishop pair and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure if the bishop retreats. Reclaiming the bishop to c3 activates the piece along the diagonal and prepares for potential central breakthroughs or pawn pushes, aiming to disrupt black's solid structure developed so far. Exchanging that knight clears the c-file for your rook, creating attacking possibilities, but you've also given up your strong knight outpost on e4. Now white's pieces can coordinate more freely, and you'll need to be mindful of their increased central influence and potential for pawn advances. Consider how you'll challenge white's bishop pair on the king side. Opening the b-file for your rook now creates dynamic potential, though it does leave the c3 pawn somewhat isolated and a potential target if black can organize pressure there. Unbalancing the pawn structure and opening a dangerous diagonal for the bishop is a bold, albeit risky, attempt to seize the initiative by creating immediate tactical complications. White bravely carves out a central pawn presence, solidifying their queenside structure while creating a robust pawn chain that aims to control more squares. This move, however, initiates a strategic tug-of-war on the king side. By advancing the f-pawn, white weakens their king's shelter, potentially opening lines for black's pieces to exploit if the defense falters. Observe how this pawn's journey dictates future kingside pawn breaks and defensive considerations. Opening the f-file here is a bold statement, deliberately sacrificing pawn structure for dynamic possibilities. The immediate capture on e5 creates a sharp imbalance, transforming the pawn chain and potentially exposing white's king. Consider the ensuing battle for control of the newly opened file and how the doubled c-pawns might become a weakness or a strength later on. This decision injects a significant dose of tactical complexity into the game, moving away from the positional maneuvering of the opening. Unlocking the f-file now presents white with a clear path to pressure black's weakened kingside structure, a vital consideration as the game transitions towards a more dynamic middle game phase. Reorienting the knight towards the queen side, 13. e7 aims to evade the pin on f6 and prepare a potential kingside pawn push or a regrouping maneuver, while the doubled c-pawns offer white a structural advantage that black hopes to exploit by activating their pieces. Initiating development and asserting central influence, knight hops to a more active square, preparing to engage in the coming skirmishes and offering a protective screen for the queenside pawns, while simultaneously eyeing the weakened dark squares around black's king. Probing the central pawn chain with c5, black seeks to destabilize white's pawn structure and open lines for their pieces, particularly the queen and rook, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially create dynamic counterplay. Securing the monarch by tucking it away behind pawns represents a prudent measure, prioritizing king safety amidst the unfolding complications on the queen side. Initiating queenside counterplay by challenging white's central pawn structure and opening avenues towards the king's flank is a bold endeavor. The black queen's repositioning aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially create weaknesses on the c3 square, while simultaneously surveying the battlefield for immediate threats or future targets. Unveiling a central presence, the queen now eyes the queenside, anticipating potential pawn advances and aiming to bolster the kingside defense should black's knights find more active squares. Bishops, no longer doubled on the c-file, now focus their attention on the queenside expansion brewing from black's queen and bishop. Okay, let's break down this move for you. You've just played bd7, and I want to highlight a few key aspects of this position, specifically focusing on the pawn structure and the potential for both sides. You're really trying to solidify your kingside defense here, which makes sense given white's rather exposed king position earlier. The d7 square is a good post for the bishop, offering support to your e7 knight and potentially looking to join the fight on the queen side or even swing over to attack white's doubled pawns. White has a bit of a structural mess with those doubled c-pawns, but that central pawn majority on d4 and e5 gives them a strong foothold. Their knight on f3 is well placed, and the queen on e1 is eyeing your kingside. Now about your move. bd7 is a sensible, quiet development. It gets your bishop off the h3-c8 diagonal where it was somewhat passively placed after white's bxc3. From d7, it can potentially support a cxd4 push if white allows it, or it can prepare to retreat if the queenside action heats up. You're looking to coordinate your pieces and prepare for the next stage of the game, which will likely involve fighting for central control and potentially exploiting white's pawn weaknesses. Keep an eye on that e5 pawn. It's a strong central outpost for white, and you'll want to find a way to challenge it, perhaps with c5 followed by d4 or by harassing it with your pieces. This bishop move is a step in the right direction for building up your coordination. Unlocking the c-file with this pawn thrust aims to destabilize black's queenside pawn structure and potentially activate white's rook, while simultaneously challenging black's centralized knight and queen coordination. A bold decision to simplify the board, inviting an early queen trade that could lead to a pawn-up advantage for white, or a strategically active endgame for black if they can exploit the weakened queenside pawns. Recapturing on e1 with the rook immediately addresses the open e-file, placing it on a central highway and preparing for potential maneuvering or pressure on the kingside. The immediate capture of the pawn resolves some tension on the queen side, but it also opens the d-file for white's rook, potentially leading to increased activity there. This pawn grab could be a slight positional concession, as it allows white to consolidate their pawn structure and potentially use the newly opened file to their advantage. It's crucial for black to be mindful of the resulting pawn structure and ensure their pieces are coordinated to meet any advances white might initiate. Bringing the bishop to the active square to contest the open files and prepare for potential pawn advances. Initiating a bold pawn thrust deep into enemy territory, black challenges the central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's pawn majority and potentially open lines for piece activity. This exchange forces white to make a decision regarding their central control, and could lead to a more dynamic, potentially less predictable middle game where black can seek counterplay on the queen side. Seizing an undefended pawn with the bishop drastically alters the pawn's structure, creating immediate dynamic potential and potentially opening a crucial file for white's rook. Seizing the initiative on the queen side, this timely rook maneuver immediately puts pressure on white's isolated b-pawn, forcing a decisive response and disrupting white's queenside structure even further. A daring outpost established on a6, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially sever the connection between the rook and the rest of the army while the bishop retreats to safety from the looming pawn advance. Repositioning the rook to the fourth rank forces white's bishop back, aiming to contest the open c-file and prepare for potential advances on the queen side. Asserting control over the central d-file and preparing to challenge black's queen's rook is the immediate objective here, aiming to exploit the slight disorder in black's queenside pawn structure and potentially isolate those advanced pawns. Unleashing a pawn thrust, black challenges white's rook on the d-file and threatens to disrupt the central pawn structure, aiming to gain valuable space and potentially open lines for counterplay. Seizing the open d-file now offers immediate counterplay and a chance to disrupt black's nascent queenside pressure. With this capture, black initiates a complex pawn liquidation that could redefine the pawn structure and open up critical diagonal lines, potentially transforming the middle game into a race for initiative. Boldly reclaiming the central pawn, white ignites a tense battle for control of the open d-file, a crucial artery in this complex middle game, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the monarch. The bishop on c6 now stands as a bulwark against white's advancing pawns, simultaneously eyeing the weakened c4 square and bolstering the defense of black's d-pawn, creating a subtle yet potent defensive structure. Recapturing on the d-file reestablishes white's central pawn presence and aims to exploit the open c-file for the rook, seeking to create immediate attacking prospects against black's somewhat vulnerable king. Clearing the d-file with this capture sacrifices a piece for rapid development of your remaining forces and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for your queen and bishops to exploit the now weakened kingside. Reclaiming the initiative, this knight maneuver instantly shores up the d-pawn and prepares to contest the central d-file, a critical artery for kingside operations in this slightly fragmented position. Asserting central control after the exchange of queens becomes paramount, and this bishop's journey aims to disrupt white's nascent pawn chain while preparing to contest the crucial d-file. Asserting control over the queenside expanse, this maneuver proactively secures valuable space and anticipates potential pawn pushes. A valiant attempt to awaken the slumbering king's flank and inject some life into the queenside, this maneuver forces white to confront the burgeoning threat on the semi-open file and consider their next defensive steps. Reclaiming the central file establishes dominance, preparing to contest the e-file and potentially launch an assault on black's now exposed kingside. The knight's relocation to g6 aims to improve its defensive coverage and potentially prepare for future kingside action, offering a more central role than its previous station on e7, while also providing a shield for the e5 pawn from white's rook. Unlocking the queenside pawn's potential by repositioning the bishop to a more influential square, aiming to pressure the c-file and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Securing the monarch's safety becomes paramount with this relocation, aiming to untangle the king from the immediate central chaos and prepare for its active participation in the unfolding endgame skirmish. Securing a foothold for the knight on a5 allows white to initiate a pawn advance, aiming to restrict black's mobility and potentially create a passed pawn. The knight's sudden leap forward disrupts white's queenside pawn structure, creating an immediate tactical threat and forcing white to reevaluate their control over the file. Pushing the pawn aggressively here aims to sever the black knight's escape route and force a decision, potentially creating a passed pawn if black isn't careful with their king's safety. Reawakening the rook from its passive slumber, This move injects dynamism into black's position by immediately challenging white's advanced bishop and simultaneously preparing to contest the open G file. The rook finds a more active post, aiming to support the knight's advance and potentially apply pressure down the now open D file should the bishop retreat. The knight scurries to a commanding central outpost, eyeing the exposed white monarch and promising to disrupt any coordinated defensive efforts. Unleashing a decisive attack, the rook swings into action, forcing a crucial decision from black's king and aiming to exploit the exposed nature of its position. The monarch bravely ventures from its shelter, seeking a more active role in the ongoing skirmish. Relocating the knight to the queen side opens up a path for its potential advance, aiming to disrupt black's recently acquired positional advantages and threatening to infiltrate crucial defensive zones. A crucial redeployment for the knight, seeking to solidify a more active central presence and potentially disrupt white's attacking plans. Reclaiming the knight opens up the central diagonal for your remaining pieces and prepares to consolidate your material advantage. The black king, now liberated from its castled sanctuary, ventures toward the center, aiming to disrupt white's material advantage by participating actively in the remaining skirmishes. Shifting the bishop to the more active B7 square aims to exploit the open files and potential weaknesses around black's king, while also increasing pressure on the D5 pawn. Initiating a pawn sacrifice to unlock the bishop's diagonal, black aims to disrupt white's consolidated structure and create tactical opportunities around the isolated pawn, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for counterplay. The pawn's journey to the 7th rank is finally complete, opening avenues for immediate promotion threats and forcing black to dedicate significant resources to its containment. Shifting the king to the center now, while seemingly proactive, exposes it to the watchful eye of white's rook on the 7th rank, potentially leading to a swift endgame squeeze if black isn't careful with piece activity. Preserving the pawn structure and creating a defensive outpost for the rook, this move aims to prevent black's knight from infiltrating further down the kingside and potentially offers some breathing room for the white king. Bringing the rook back to the 2nd rank injects immediate life into the dormant black forces, aiming to harass the white king by utilizing the now open G-file and disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain. Securing the passed pawn's advance across the board demands vigilance. Its onward march now appears inevitable, posing a significant threat to black's already fractured pawn structure. The black king now scurries to the corner, a defensive retreat seeking shelter behind its pawns as white's rook eyes the open file. The king finally emerges from its protective shell, aiming to join the fray and provide crucial support for the distant pawns. Bringing the rook back to the open D-file intends to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay, but it also risks allowing white to consolidate their advantage on the queen side with the pawn. Bringing the king into play is crucial now to support the rook and potentially create opposition in the center. This pawn push effectively shores up the C4 square and prepares to bring the queen actively into the game, potentially targeting the weakened kingside. A bold king march begins, aiming to activate this often passive piece and exert influence on the queenside pawns. Reclaiming the pawn on the 7th rank now opens up the B-file for your rook, preparing to apply pressure on white's weakened queenside and potentially creating advanced passed pawns for you later in the endgame. Activating the rook to the F-file presents the most direct route to attack black's vulnerable pawns and potentially liberate white's other rook.